everybody, welcome to the Toledo Museum of Art. My name's Maura, I'm going to be your narrator today. We're live streaming today, so if at any point you have any questions, you can go ahead and type them in the comments, and we got Caitlin behind the camera who can read them to us. We have a special demonstration today as sort of part of our GAPP residency, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. So we're going to be doing something a little bit different today, but really quickly I want to go through all of our equipment in case anybody's never seen a glass blowing demonstration before. So Misha, all the way down there, is down by our furnace. That holds about 600 to 700 pounds of molten glass. Inside there we got a nice big bowl. It's called a crucible. It's basically a large ceramic bowl that can withstand high temperatures, and that sits at about 2100 degrees. And we leave that running 24/7, 365. We only turn it off if we ever have to do any maintenance on it. Our next most important piece of equipment is our pipe warmer. And Misha's got one of our stainless steel blowpipes. And hot glass really only sticks to hot things. So we got to preheat all of our pipes so that way Misha can physically gather up that glass. So Misha's going to preheat that a little bit into our reheating chamber. So once glass comes out of the furnace, you'll notice it's going to cool down pretty quickly. So in order for us to get it all the way back up into that working temperature, Misha's got to heat it back up so we can come back to our reheating chamber and sort of make that all nice and warm and gooey again. It's a lot of up and down and up and down. Then we have our nice bench. You'll notice Misha's sitting at the bench, and I might reference the bench as we're talking. Next to our bench, we have our tool deck. So that's all of the space for all of Misha's tools. So today we're going to be doing something a little bit different as part of our GAPP residency. George is actually a neon artist. So George Vidas is our GAPP artist, and today we're going to be making one of these. So we're sort of cross-pollinating within the studios. Right now we're busy setting up our neon studio, and soon we'll be able to have classes offered with that. But our guest artist pavilion project is sort of an opportunity for us to bring in different artists. So normally maybe twice a year we could bring in artists to make work within the museum. You got it?
Yep, I got it.
Oh, okay. So this is a really great opportunity for us to, especially with George, really explore the limitations of the material. And we can talk a little bit about neon later on and how it works, but we're always using soft glass. So our glass is soft glass, meaning that it's soda lime glass. So that means it's a mixture of silica, which is the basis for all glass, and basically the basis for all rocks that are both on Earth and Mars. Everything's made out of silica. And then we can pump a little bit of flux in there, or soda ash, and that allows us to melt that silica at a much lower temperature. If we were just melting pure silica, we'd have to go all the way up to 4,000. And trust me, it's already warm enough in here. We don't want to have to get anything any hotter. And we're melting soda lime glass, and that lime is the limestone. And limestone's really great because it makes our glass not water soluble. If we look in our ancient gallery, all of that glass is sort of starting to go rainbow and break down. So if we stuck that in a bucket of water, eventually it's going to break down and totally disappear. This glass, much, much stronger, which is important for what George is using it for. So George makes work out of neon. So we're going to make this object, and you'll notice the one I showed you has something called an electrode stuck to the end of it. We can show that again. This little guy. So this is our electrode. This is going to allow George to pump this full of neon and then turn it into sort of an illuminated globe. So George has been calling these terrariums. They're just a little bit different from what our normal traditional neon sign is, right? Because neon signage is a long, long history of you get pre-made tubes, you bend them, and then you have your own sign. But in this case, George is making his own tubing here. So we can get a little bit more creative and have a lot more control over the thickness of his glass and sort of how we want that to light up. So these are really fun because normally in a neon sign you'd have that narrow, narrow tube and you'd only have one bright light. But when we pump these full of light, it really gives you a much more ambient glow because it's not one beam of light traveling from one end to the other. It's one beam of light traveling into the entire globe. So while I was talking about that, Misha's doing our normal setup that we usually talk about. This is the glass blowing part, right? So Misha's got that nice hollow tube. And you'll notice he's not wearing any gloves. All of our equipment pretty much is made out of stainless steel. So it's a really bad conductor of heat. If Misha's pipe were made out of, let's say, copper, he's gonna really, really burn his hands. But we need that dexterity in order to turn that pipe. So Misha's put a little bubble in there. He's shaped it up with our wooden block, which is a really nice tool. All of our tools are made either out of stainless steel or a fruit wood. And fruit wood has a really tight grain pattern, so there's not a lot of sap in there. So if we were to use something like oak, it's going to catch on fire really, really quickly. We want to have that nice and waterlogged. And the wood never actually makes contact with the glass in terms of the block. It's really only creating a steam barrier. It's that same effect that if you have a hot pan on your stove and you throw a little bit of water in there, that water dances around a little bit. That's called the Leidenfrost effect. And we can use that to our advantage in order to shape this glass up. So Misha's got a little bit of air in there. You can really see the thickness of the bubble. That's the nice thing about working with clear glass. Normally we make colorful demos, and here you can really see the interior of the bubble. And you can really see how it's changing as Misha's inflating. And when Misha's inflating, he's not blowing really, really hard. You have to think about it sort of like a balloon. If Misha blows really, really hard and the glass is really, really hot, it can really easily pop through. And then we can't obviously make anything out of that. But if Misha blows too light, it's not going to inflate at the rate that he wants. So he's got a little bit of control. Usually when you come in, you see a demonstration, we're working much more closely, right? So as a factor with COVID-19, Misha has his lovely blow hose at the end. So that really allows him to blow solo. So there's no contact between the pipe, between any of us, and we can keep things really, really safe. The trouble with that is he's got a nice hose stuck to the bottom. So half of the time Misha's on hose management. So what Misha's doing right now is a little bit of bottom weighting. George's objects are going to end up, if you see the drawing on the floor, the bottom is going to be the top. So Misha wants to make sure that he's got enough thickness up by the shoulder. But we're actually going to neckline. And you'll notice nothing in the collection has a pipe stuck to the end of it. So we have to design everything so that we can get it off of the pipe at some point. So Misha's got that nice neck in there, and then he's got his nice constriction line. He's using our newspaper tool to physically make sure that's nice and straight. Because when we're working in here, we're always trying to be on center. If you take a pottery class at the beginning, you know, you sort of center the clay. When we're working in here, we have to stay on center the entire time. So it's a little bit more management in terms of keeping things even. But if Misha ever lets something fall off center and we go to open it up, it's going to open up totally crooked. It's important to stay on center. So now that Misha's got his constriction line in, we're just going to heat the bottom of the bubble. When I talk about the bubble, I talk about it a lot like a body, right? So the part that's closest to the moil, or the part that's still on the pipe, is our neck. And then just below our neck, we have our shoulder, and then sometimes I'll call the bottom the foot. In this case, the foot doesn't really apply, because the foot is where the bubble makes contact with the table. And usually we'd have to do a lot of extra work to make sure that's nice and clean. For this case, we get to do the work later. That's George's problem, not ours. So you can see Misha's using a little bit of gravity. And the entire time you'll notice Misha's turning. And he's really fighting against gravity in order to keep this thing on center. But we can really use the elongating properties to really make this nice and stretched. So whenever Misha's going straight up and down, since he has a little bit more thickness on the foot of the bubble, it's going to pull at the side walls and lengthen them out. And when Misha's inflating, the air wants to go where the glass is the hottest. So the tip of the bubble is the first thing in the reheating chamber and the last thing that comes out. So if he just tries to inflate this thinner and thinner, it's not going to stretch out those walls quite like how he wants. You want to paddle? Okay. He's just going to put in a little pop. And we're going to physically open this up, and George is going to put something called frit in. And George is going to put in a special kind of frit that comes from our neon tubing. So frit is basically crushed up colored glass. But in this case, George has taken some neon tubing that was pre-manufactured, and it all has this phosphor coating on the inside, and that's what determines the color of the light. So we're going to put some of that phosphor coated tube inside of our bubble And once George pumps this with light, it'll be able to reflect those colors. What Misha's doing right now is using our fluffy torch. So today you'll notice us using a lot of different torches, and torches allow us to really spot heat specific areas within the glass. So when Misha goes into the reheating chamber, it's sort of an aggressive heat from all directions. So when Misha's using that fluffy, he's really making sure that he's spot heating one particular area. Once we have our neckline in there, and if Misha were to get this thing really, really hot all over, it's going to be much harder to turn. I know Misha wants to make sure it's nice and easy. Things are already hard enough in here, so you really have to be on top of managing how your body is moving. So Misha's going to go in with our paper, and since he's just torched that specific area, you'll notice the top of the bubble isn't moving at all. He's really setting up the back side of our bubble, which is inevitably going to be the bottom of our glass once George is done with it. Do you want to paddle?
Yeah, I'll have to paddle back.
Okay. So we're going to do that one more time, make sure it's nice and clean. We have this nice fruit wood that our blocks are, so you'll notice it can take a lot of heat before it starts to catch fire.
Good.
Now that we got that nice and cleaned up, we can start to open up the top. And I can show them this. So this is sort of our cool new frit with that phosphor coated tubing. So you can see this tiny little piece of tubing. George can just crush that up, and we can use it in an unconventional way. So in order to get this open, Misha's just going to heat the top up. And remember, when Misha's blowing, the air wants to go where the glass is the hottest. So we can spot heat a nice little spot, blow a little bit, pop a little bubble, and then Misha can tweeze it open. And normally when you watch a demonstration, you see us sort of tweeze and open and make sure it's nice and even. But Misha's going to set this up a little bit differently because we got to get the frit in, and then we got to close it back down for George's globe shape. So Misha's going to go in with his tweezers, pull himself a little handle, go in with his diamonds, which is another really cool glass blowing tool. This allows us to cut from all directions. So you'll notice the entire time Misha's working, he's working in the round. Right, we can never stop and just cut in one area. So those allow him to cut from both sides. So Misha's got his nice little handle. Okay. He's gonna go in with his diamond shears. Give it a quick cool with the jacks. I can give it a little tap. And it comes right off. That's using that same principle as the jack line. When you first start blowing glass, you sort of make little snowmen. And you'll notice wherever the constriction line is the tightest is where the glass wants to break. So with this type of object, Misha wants to make sure his original jack line is warm and happy, but we can really neck that in at the tip and physically break it off to make it nice and clean. Okay. You don't need a door, do you? So now Misha's going to go in and he's going to make sure that's nice and on center, but he's going to use his jacks in a different way. Remember, our tool deck's only this big, so this is all of the space we get. So everything has to have a lot of different uses. So Misha's going to go in and he's going to physically lift his jacks up. And you'll notice this is really about the turning. So you think, oh, Misha's right hand's the one with the tools, it's doing all of the work. But Misha's left hand has to put in a lot more work than anything else. So Misha's going to open that up. Give it a nice little torch with the MAP gas. And we're getting it just open enough so that George can get in there. He has a nice little spoon on a stick. That way he doesn't have to get too close to the glass. And he can physically spoon that frit in.
I'm gonna squeeze it down with paper a little bit, George. Say again? You're just gonna squeeze that diameter down with paper a little bit. Okay. And then I'll make sure that you fit in. Fishbowl.
Yeah, it is very fishbowl. So Misha's made that nice opening so that George can get in there. Just gonna make sure it's nice and on center, not too wide. And now we can get to the fun part. So now we're gonna preheat this a little bit, right? Because hot glass only sticks to hot things. But in our case, if we have our glass hot enough, our frit's gonna stick pretty easily. So George is gonna go in, he's gonna take a couple of spoonfuls. This looks like white glass. I'm not sure if it's actually white. He's going in with another hot torch. Sorry, fluffy, but more specific. Yeah, I gotcha. Oops, sorry. Those awnings always get me. So George is specifically heating the interior of our bubble and also heating up our frit a little bit. So that way it'll stick in there really nice and make really nice contact. So I bet we're gonna do that a couple times, build up some layering. George is gonna take another spoonful, go right in. The spoon on the stick is really nice because although it may not look super hot, if George were to get any closer, he would really start to feel that heat on his hands. So now we can go back in with that hot torch. And when George is heating, he's really heating the interior of the bubble. So we have to think about this sort of in three-dimensional space. We don't want to put the frit on the outside because then the phosphor won't react with the neon and make the colors. So we got to stick it on the inside so we can physically heat the interior of that bubble and just have the frit stick inside there while not disrupting the form of the object. So Misha's gonna melt that in a little bit. George might do another color.
No, that's it. I think.
Okay.
Were they still moving?
Yeah, they're moving a little bit.
So let's push it a little bit more, and then I'm gonna try and squeeze out the stuff down the collar. Oh, don't worry about it. If that seems like it's tacked up to you, I'm good.
They want to make sure that it's nice and tack view. So once George starts pumping stuff in there, we don't have to worry about loose bits of glass. So now we can start to close this back down. So my favorite thing about glass is that it's infinitely recyclable. So we could let this totally cool down to room temperature and then bring it all the way back up to working temp. So Misha's let this nice and set up a little bit, make sure it's nice and stable so George can get the frit in. And now we're gonna bring it all the way back up to working temperature at the tip. So Misha's got his hot torch, which lets him spot heat that specific area. And then we can start to close this down.
One more time. Say again. I might torch once more. Just to get a little bit more heat. You hated that to me because I was in the way, right? I can either stay there and grab it from you or not be there and let you do it, whichever you prefer.
Misha's gonna give that one more heat. Building heat back up can be tough, especially if we were to do it in the reheating chamber, just because it's so aggressive from all sides.
Like, hold it upright and drop out that loose stuff.
Oh yeah, there we go.
Just clean it up a little.
So now Misha can reattach his blow hose and we're gonna physically close this bubble back down. Right, because when the bubble's open, we can't blow in there. The air's just gonna go right out the hole. So we'll close it back up and then we can start to work on our globe shape. Misha's gonna go in with his jacks. And when he's squeezing, he's not squeezing crazy hard, right? If Misha squeezes really hard, those jacks are flat, so it's just gonna create a flat spot. He's squeezing really, really gently, and the turning is really doing most of the work. So we're gonna give that a little bit of a, so we'll constrict down, and Misha just has to get it narrow enough so that he can cut that off with his diamond shears, just like we did to break it open. So when Misha's heating now, it's really important to be careful, right? Because we like to say glass has this memory. So every time Misha touches it with a tool and every time he hits it with a torch, that glass is going to remember that heat. So he's got to be really careful to keep the heat just perfect on the front and make sure that back doesn't start to move at all. And we can keep closing down. The tough thing about glass is that it's a really good insulator. So if we have really thin glass, it heats up really quickly and cools down really quickly. But if our glass is a little bit thicker, it's going to stay hot for a really long time. So since the tip of Misha's bubble is the thinnest part, you'll notice he has to get up and down and up and down and up and down. This process is intensive on your body. It's a lot of up and down for Misha. So he'll give it a nice heat on the front. You're fine. Are we making 2 of these?
Depending on the time.
Okay. So we're going to constrict that down, and now we've just got it pretty close to closed. Okay. When we're working in here, you want to be really gentle with the material. So we never want to get it crazy hot, right? Because if we get it crazy hot, it's going to be really hard to control. So Misha's going to get it nice and warm enough so that he can get it really moving. And then he's going to constrict down with his jacks. Now we're going to move on to our diamond shears, but that's going to allow him to physically close that bubble off. Especially when you're closing something back down, it's going to leave a mark no matter what, just from that shear mark. But if Misha were to go in with his diamond shears right at the beginning when it's really wide, it's going to leave a really big scar. Remember, glass has that memory. Remembers every time you touch it with a tool. So Misha's going to go in with his torch, just torch the part where he cut off to sort of alleviate some of that scarring. And once we've got a nice sealed bubble, now we can start to put a little bit more air into it. I know we're not going too crazy huge with these, but since it's closed off, Misha can inflate it a little bit.
And then I'll set the stretch the neck a little bit.
Oh, okay. You can see that little bubble. Misha can smooth that out with this newspaper. And I'm not sure if we talked about the newspaper tool, but that's actually just 8 to 10 sheets of newspaper folded up. The toughest thing about glass blowing is that we can never touch the material, right? Misha can't make a cup and feel the side of it in his hand while it's on the pipe. So we really have to plan ahead when we're working in here. So in order to really feel the sides of the glass, Misha could go in with that newspaper and really make sure the profile of it is nice and smooth. Oh, cute. Inflate this some more?
Just a little bit, and then I'll stretch the neck.
Just a little bit? Okay. We're going to make it a little bit bigger. Misha's going to stretch this neck out a little bit, because the tough thing about welding George's electrode on is that we have to make sure that the diameter can fit nicely. If at any point it doesn't fuse completely, the gas will start to leak out, and then we can't fill it with light. So Misha's going to make sure this is nice and round and globy. This one looks really nice with the globe. And then we're going to pull that neck out a little bit, just so that George has a really nice point to make contact with. Misha's using a MAP gas torch. This is a little bit softer than his hot torch, that big thing we were using earlier. It gives a little bit more of a specific heat than our fluffy though. So Misha, what? Okay, sounds good. So Misha, we're just fluffy that thing. It's too large. The fire of the fluffy is going to be too widespread. So he wants to get really, really specific, but not quite as hot as his hot torch. So he's got a nice little happy medium in the MAMP gas. We're going to build up a little bit of heat in this so we can get it moving. Normally when you see a demonstration in here, we're really using the heat of the furnace. And this is the part where we're really getting specific in how we want to heat the glass to really have control over how it's shaped. And that's where torches really, really come in handy. A lot of times you'll see hot sculptors using a lot of torches, so whenever we do sculpting demos, you'll notice us use different torches for different heats. But in the case of glass blowing, we really focus on using sort of the traditional way of heating. Sometimes you can get away with a little torching for a little cheating, make things a little easier. But with the case of specificity, torches are your friend. So he's just gonna go in. He's going to stretch that out a little bit. And now that that glass is pretty set up, Misha can actually pull pretty hard on this. He's setting the diameter with his jacks and then physically elongating that neck out a little bit, just so that we can match George's diameter a little bit better.
Looks good. Where are you going to knock it off at? That first jack line? Yeah. Where it has to tighten. Cool. Want me to tighten that down a little bit? Where are you going to knock off at? At that jack line? I can tighten that down just a little more. No, that looks good. And then there's a lot of room for me to do a second one after it's through. Okay. I like that it's kind of mushroomy. That's exactly what I was thinking. I think that's pink and blue. Maybe like some blue and red in the light. Pretty good. Right.
So now we're going to get ready to take this thing off. And normally, right, we take off a demo. Normally now's the part where we'd plenty, flip it around, make it nice and smooth. But we're getting a little experimental here today. So we're going to knock this off, and then George is going to physically weld an electrode onto the top, which is the part that allows us to pump neon into it. Misha's going to let it set up a little bit. I'm going to put some gloves on really quick. And this will just allow me to physically be able to hold that glass so we can put it away in our annealing oven. Misha will give you a nice view there. And I know that glass inside looks white, but as George starts to illuminate it, it's totally going to change color. Blue and pink. So we got blue and pink in there. Misha's going to flash that down a little bit. When we're taking a piece off, we want to make sure the heat and it's really nice and even, right? Because that tip of that bubble was just hot enough for Misha to really physically crank down on it with his diamond shears. So we got to let that set up a little bit. We want our neck to set up a little bit before we're ready to take this off. You want me to hold it while you put the electrode on? Okay.
I like it upright.
Okay.
But
I can be there just in case.
I think we have a lot of time.
So Misha's going to use a couple drops of water. And that little bit of thermal shock is going to be enough to physically break this off of our pipe. Give it a little tap. Then George is going to come in here with another hot torch. And on the end of that larger tube that he has is a nice little electrode, just like I showed you before. And he's welding that on just hot glass to hot glass. And he's giving it a little blow, making sure that it's nice and sealed. Gonna pop a bubble. No biggie for him. He can smooth it out. And when we're working in here, George just needs these to be nice and sealed, so that way we can pump that stuff in. If there's any holes in the glass, all of that gas is gonna wanna escape out of them. So George wants to make sure they're nice and stable. And we can load it away in our annealing oven. So we're gonna make another one of these. Do we have time?
Yeah, that was half an hour on the dot.
Oh, perfect. But I can talk a little bit about annealing. We'll put another one away so you guys can see the annealer. But annealing is the process of cooling that glass down. So if we have sort of fresh glass off the pipe, we leave it just out in the room temperature air. the air is physically cold enough to break that glass. And in our case, George is going to put it actually through a lot of stress in our next process when he goes to bombard it and pump it. So we want to make sure we're alleviating all of the stress out of there. So that's sitting at about 918. That's a temperature where you sort of become familiar with the state of matter of glass, right? It's not that flowiness of the furnace and also not totally shatterable in room temperature. Sort of its happy medium. So Misha's gonna go ahead and get started. The next round we sort of have to talk about, especially when we're working experimentally like this. The past couple days, we started our residency on Monday. It's sort of been, you try one thing, you see what happens, we do it again, we see what happens. George is really pushing the limits of experimental with the material, which is a nice opportunity. Traditionally, when we're working with neon, we never actually bring furnace glass in there. You would use entirely pre-made tubes. And in this case, it gives us a little bit of an opportunity to use all of the resources that we have within the hot shop and then take it over to our bombarding table in our neon studio. And we're still working on setting up the neon shop. I think the first opportunity people are going to have to take a class is through our master classes. So we're going to have one neon master class. If you guys have any interest in that, all of that stuff is on the website, and then you can apply for scholarships for it. So if you want to learn more about neon and working with the tubes, that's sort of our first great opportunity to do so. So we're going to start this sort of similarly. Misha's got a nice little starter bubble. We put these starter bubbles in just because once Misha has all of that massive glass, it can take a lot more air pressure to physically inflate that. So we put a nice little starter bubble. And the hardest part of gathering is really determining your volume of glass, right? So think of it sort of like sticking a chopstick into honey. You gotta wind it up on the chopstick. It's really hard to turn. But if we have a little bit more volume of the bubble, it'll allow Misha to get a little bit more material. There's our nice bubble. The best part about clear glass is that you can physically see the interior. So normally when we do the demos, we make something out of color. Misha sort of guesses based on experience how much wall thickness he has. But in here, with the clear glass, he really has a lot of control, which is really great for George because normally neon tubing comes in one sort of thickness. But in here, we can start to create thicker and thicker tubing, and that'll allow us to have different optical effects. Because the glass sort of, by nature, with thickness, distorts light. And neon is pure light. So this will give George a lot more opportunity to find interesting components within the glass. Misha's going back on with our wooden block tool. Every time you see us make something, the setup sort of starts like this. We got our nice starter bubble in the middle. We take another gather on top, and then we can block it into that nice round shape. People started using these wooden blocks just to sort of speed everything up. So if we were to take glass out of the furnace and just turn in the air, the glass naturally wants to be in that Q-tip shape. And if Misha turns even enough, eventually it'll get back there. But time is money. Glass is all about heat. Misha needs a Q-tip shape now. So we can use that block, shape it up really quick, make it nice and even. And Misha will set this up just like our last terrarium. So when he's blocking, he's setting up the outer layer of glass. So when we're working in here, it's all about layers, right? Misha had his first starter bubble layer. We let that set up, and we can put another layer on top. For Misha to get enough glass to physically make an object all at once, he's gonna have to turn really, really fast. Like, superhuman fast. So, we gotta work in layers. Misha's going over to our Marver table. This is just a large piece of stainless steel. So what this allows us to do is sort of reinforce that memory I talked about. This period. So when you first start making cups, they're always really thin on the bottom. And in this case, our bottoms are topped, so it's a little bit backwards, but we want to make sure that we have a nice amount of thickness on the bottom, because when we're working in here, we can't set anything on the table right now, right? Everything's way too hot. So we gotta sort of learn from experience of what successfully makes it. So glass is a really fragile material. When you're working with glass, like when you first start, everything breaks. And you sort of have to get used to the sound of breaking glass. But if we can avoid it, Misha's got enough experience doing this that he knows what steps he needs to take to make sure everything's nice and solid. So we've got our jack line in just like we did before. Misha pulled that nice little neck out. And now we can sort of get to the opening phase. Do you have different colors this time, George? Or are we doing pink and blue again?
Blue, pink, and white.
Blue, pink, and white.
I left that UV light on overnight, so the batteries are dead, so I can't show you.
Oh, well that's fun. That's okay. They can see during your lovely talk. So George is hosting a talk on March 16th at 7 p.m. Normally we would do these in the glass salon, but I think this one is all virtual, so you'll be able to see George through live stream. All of that information is on our website if you want more specific details about ticketing and times, but you can all access that. And that's a really good time to listen to George talk about exactly how neon works. It's sort of a really complicated yet simple process. And a lot can be said about sort of all forms of working with glass, right? It's all very technical and scientific, but a lot of us just learn through experience. Sort of like alchemy. Misha's gonna heat that up. We're gonna inflate that one up nice and mushroom shaped like the last one. And Misha starts out sort of in that little skittle shape, so that way we can physically open up the end so that George can get more of that frit in there. Misha's going back on with his newspaper. And he's sort of creating a reverse neck, right? Because we got that nice bottleneck sort of close to the pipe. This is sort of the similar setup. But then Misha can just tweeze out and we'll knock that tip off again. Misha's got that nice fluffy torch again, really shaping that back. The toughest part about making bottles, and this is sort of a bottle shape that we're converting into a nice terrarium, is that we really can't inflate that shoulder once we've pulled that neck out. So that fluffy torch really allows us to put some more air back in there and really start to thin out the bottom. George is putting these on stands, so we want to make sure that they have a nice point of contact to make with the stand, so that way he can cover up the electrode and all of that wiring. So Misha puts a little bit of heat in there, and he can start to inflate and really shape this up. And when Misha's blowing, he's not blowing crazy hard. This glass is still pretty fresh, so it'll still heat up pretty quickly. So if he were to blow really, really hard, it's going to inflate too much in an area that he doesn't want. And you can always put more air in, but you can't take any air out. So it's always good to be a little bit extra cautious. George is smashing up some frit over there. George is taking pre-made tubing, right? So the cool thing about glass is all of the glass that George works with is soda lime glass. So it's totally compatible with our glass. If you were to use something like borosilicate glass, like your traditional Pyrex glass, the stuff you can boil water in, that's not going to actually work with our glass. It's a totally different coefficient of expansion and will actually crack and break off. But since George has this nice pre-made glass, it's the same coefficient of expansion, we can introduce it right into our own glass and it has no problem. Misha's making that nice little handle again. He's going to go on and squeeze. Oop, I'm going to grab some tweezers. And we're going to use that same principle we used before to knock this off. So Misha has that nice heat differential right where he's putting his jacks into that nice crevice. And he's going to make sure it's nice and cold. He's going to go on with his diamond shears, give it a good crimp. I'll give it a little tap. It comes right off. Your cup jacks? Oh, yeah, I gotcha. Misha's gonna get a little bit smaller of a set of jacks. He's got a nice narrow hole, so we got jacks of all sizes for all hole shapes. So Misha's gonna spot heat that hole, and he's gonna use the jacks in a different orientation. He's gonna physically open it up like a mold. If we were making something sort of traditional like a cup, we could really use our jacks to rip it open and really set the wall sides. But in this case, Misha's just making a space so that George can get in there with his spoon and get all of that nice frit in there. Need a paddle? Okay. Misha's got one jack lid. And the tough thing about when you have a small hole like that, it's really nice because you can sort of have enough control to open and make things nice and even. But if we were to leave that glass in the reheating chamber too long, glass naturally wants to fuse with itself, so it'll get hot enough and sort of slump into itself and seal off. And we can just open it up again, it's no problem. But I know Misha doesn't want to have to do more work than he has to. So, we like efficiency in this studio. Misha's gonna go in. You'll see him start to sort of raise the angle that his jacks are at, and that'll create that opening, so that way George has that nice place to go in. Now that Misha's got that bubble open, he doesn't need his blow hose anymore. If we were to blow into the end of this, it's actually just going to shoot right through that hole. But we make it on the blowpipe, so we can blow the initial bubble. But when Misha closes this back down, as long as you have a closed bubble on the end of the blowpipe, you can inflate it all you want. They're going to do a price check, make sure George's spoon can fit in there. And then we can introduce some more of our frit. Oh, yeah. So George has his nice phosphor-coated neon tubing. And since it is that same coefficient of expansion, it'll stick right to our glass with no problem. He takes a couple spoonfuls, sticks it in, and then he's using our nice hot torch. You can really see the flame on that. Fire can be confusing because really the hottest part of that torch is the blue part. So it's that part with those cones near the head. So George is really just making sure that that frit's hot enough so that it'll stick to the sides of our bubble. The phosphor-coated tubing is a little bit different from our frit, so it has one side that has that coating on it, and then the other side is clear glass. So George wants to be a little bit specific with how he's physically getting this to stick in there. So we want to make sure some of that phosphor coating is on the inside of the bubble, so that way we can have that glowing color. Otherwise it'll just sort of glow that white tube that we're used to. But you can sort of see the difference. The phosphor coating is that matte side. If you really zoom in, you can see that not so shiny part. And then the shiny part is just that clear glass. We'll probably do that a couple more times. That seems like the amount of frit George wants, but we want to make sure it's nice and fused in there. We're not actually sure what will happen if we leave loose frit in there. So that could be fun. A little bit of frit. George can knock it right off. George has a nice pair of long tweezers so he can get in there and really move any flakes around that he doesn't like. So George, just physically, and those little tweezers are just sort of, I think those are actually fish tank tweezers that you can buy to sort of nicely arrange your fish tank.
You want to kind of rearrange them again before we dump the rest of it out? No, maybe try and dump the rest of it out into it so it doesn't go all the way past the hot bit. See what happens.
Lisa's getting some of that frit out of the bottleneck. And then they can fuse it back in. here, sometimes you can get really unconventional tools because glass blowing is a very niche market. So there's really only a couple people who make glass blowing tools. And when you need this sort of a specific small tool for a specific small job, you got to get creative. So anything out of stainless steel flies in here. We have our nice brass stamp that can usually work in here. Once you get to metals like copper, they'll heat up too quickly and physically fuse into the glass. Making sure all our guys are stuck.
Start needing to close it and stop.
Cool. So now we can start to close this back down. So Misha's made himself this nice little handle on the end. Looks like a nice decorative spout glass. So remember earlier we sort of talked about the chemical composition. All of those things are sort of suspended into one goo, right? So if we get it really, really hard, our flux will start to burn out. So let's say we were to leave our glass in our furnace for like 8 months, nobody touches it. All that flux can burn out really easily, and then it gets really, really stiff, and it can be really hard to work with. There's a college, I think, in Kentucky that actually uses light bulb glass, and it doesn't have any flux in it really. So it's really, really hard to work with, and you have to get it really, really hot to really do anything. So Misha will start closing that down. And at this point, Misha doesn't want to really get that frit too hot, right? Because George has it placed just how he likes it. So Misha's really going to use that torch to spot heat that little end, that little neck at the end. If he were to go into the reheating chamber and do all of that heating, it's going to totally distort the rest of our bubble. So we'll go back in with our torch, get really, really specific. Heat just the part that we want to. And Misha doesn't really want to like crank down with his jacks, right? Because there's a flat object that you turn around. So if he were to crank close, it's just going to seal it flat. It's going to leave a terrible scar right on the top of George's globe. So he's going to work gently and sort of slowly close that down. And then we can get in there with our diamond shears and close it off entirely. The nice thing about hot glass is how well it fuses to itself. So we can always cut it open, close it back down, cut it open, close it back down, pretty much indefinitely. And it'll always stick back together. Now we're getting pretty close. One more time. This is just heating the front. And we're going into the reheating chamber. We have these nice set of doors, so we can sort of open and close them with how big of an object we're making. So if we were to make something like, I don't know, Misha's got 2 gathers there. If we were to go 4 gathers, we'd have to really start opening the doors. And that's where it can start to get really, really hot. Misha's got that nice and closed down. He's going to torch that scar mark, try to smooth it back in. And now we can start to reinflate since our bubble is closed back down. Which is really the best way to work with something like this, because now Misha can really feel the sides of the terrarium. And you can feel how he's inflating and changing the shape without taking too much heat. The thing about the stainless steel tools is Misha could do this with his jacks if he wanted to, but those jacks are going to suck out the heat from the hot glass. So we can turn a lot longer with our paper on it than we can with our jacks. I'm guessing Misha's going to do that one more time, maybe a couple times. Okay. And now that it's set up pretty well, Misha can blow pretty hard. He doesn't really have to worry about the popping anymore. until we get it to that nice dome shape. So now Misha's gonna stretch that neck out again. And remember, we have to fit these onto those electrodes that George has, so that way he can physically get the neon into the ball. So Misha wants to make sure this diameter is close enough that George can weld our electrode on. So Misha's using our nice map glass torch again. It's a little bit gentler than the hot torch and not quite as broad as the fluffy. And then we can physically stretch that neck out a little bit. So now Misha can go back on with his jacks. And when he's pulling, he's not pulling super hard. The glass is pretty set up, but you still want to be gentle with it. And he can stretch that out so it's that nice diameter to match our electrode. He sort of already has his handle width set up. And then he's just physically elongating that neck out. If Misha were to start to squeeze with his jacks, it's actually going to narrow that constriction down more and more. Misha's gonna go and he's gonna make sure that jack line's nice and tight. We want it to ideally sort of match the interior wall of the electrode. It gets a little complicated because our glass here is much thicker than the glass George is used to working with. So as long as this makes a nice seal onto our electrode, we don't have to worry too much. So Misha can squeeze down pretty hard on it now. And now we're about ready to take it off. So we're gonna flash this down. You can already see it still start to move sort of at the neckline. I'm gonna go ahead and put on my gloves. And we're gonna do the same thing we did with the last one. So Misha will flash it down, get it ready to take off, and then George can physically weld our electrode on. You can see that nice ball. These are pink and blue and white. So I know that phosphor coated tubing totally looks white right now. But once George puts neon inside of it, we can start to see the colors. That's fine. No biggie. He's just going to use a little bit of water, and that's enough of a thermal shock for us to physically break this off of the pipe. So we'll give it a little bit of tap and vibration, and then George is going to come in with our hot torch.
I want to take a little bit of France with you.
Okay, I can do that. So George is going to make sure that makes nice contact. And he's got his own little air hose, sort of making sure that it's not too thick or too thin. He can pump a little bit of air into that electrode. It's got a nice little hole at the end, and that's what he'll actually hook up to the manifold to pump the neon in. Once he's got all that nice and smooth, gonna make sure everything's nice and happy. Then I'm gonna go ahead and take it and put it away. I forgot. Boop, boop. I got it. Okay, I'm out. Sorry. So now we got that guy loaded away. So those are actually going to cool down to room temperature, and then George is going to bring them back up to the temperature he needs on the bombarding table. So again, George's talk is on March 16th at 7 p.m. All of that is virtual, so you guys can come and watch it from your own homes. Otherwise, George is here this week, and then I think he has next week off, and then he's back for the next 2 weeks. So I think he'll probably do 2 more demos. So if you're interested in sort of more of the experimental processes that George is working on, we'll have a couple more demos. Both of them are on the Wednesday slot. Otherwise, we're doing demos Wednesday, Friday, and Sunday. So this Friday and this Sunday, it'll be just sort of the normal glass blowing. Otherwise, it's been really great to have George as part of GAPP, and you can sort of see more of the work that he's working on during our talk. So if you guys have any questions about what George is doing or anything, you can comment them to Caitlin. Otherwise, the gallery is open Wednesday through Sunday, so you guys can come and visit us.